I know not all of you are driving yet, but those who are can testify that sometimes you encounter sketchy situations on the road. Chelsea and I have been on countless road trips together, and if there's one thing you can count on, it's that there's going to be construction at some point on the drive. Usually there will be tons of warning signs, road construction 2 miles ahead, and stuff like that. But once in a while, it sneaks up on you. You'll be cruising along, and suddenly cones will just randomly start appearing and a sign that says, "Lane ends." And before you know it, you're boxed in and you slam on your brakes and have to try to navigate over. And to be honest, few things get your heart rate up faster than a situation like that. The point is, the warning signs were just way too close to the danger area. The boundaries needed to start way earlier. That's kind of the idea of this message. As we close out the conversation about sex and sexual integrity, there's more to it than we all think. There are multiple layers to this topic, and I wish that we could cover all of them, but you're with your groups in order to explore the more relevant layers to those in your particular group than I'm able to cover here. But what's true of driving is true of sex. Boundaries are a good thing. Think about traffic here in the United States. Can you imagine if streets had no lines, no markings, no space dividing your lane from mine, no signage to say whose turn it is to fly through the intersection? That would feel unsafe, right? It's the same way with sex. Established boundaries are important. And while we probably all agree that having boundaries is good, none of us still like being told no. Even if we're being told no by ourselves, we don't like it. The problem is that anytime there's a boundary, we feel like it's limiting our freedom. And freedom is a great thing we want more of. But even freedom is defined differently depending on who you ask. Some people view freedom as the elimination of boundaries and restrictions, but a wise person understands that actually boundaries are essential in order to have freedom. Life without boundaries is just chaos. I'll give you another silly example. Let's say you got some money for your birthday, and let's say that one of your parents says, "Hey, don't spend it all this upcoming weekend," right? And you think, "What? That's wild. I'm 16 years old. I should be able to decide how I spend my own birthday money." You wouldn't like it. But now think about this. What if you, in an effort to save up for something like new shoes, decided to show some restraint and self-control with that birthday money? What if you decided to limit yourself? And then you remembered that last time you tried to save for those shoes but spent it all on fast food after school? So you think, "I can do it this time. I'm not going to spend more than $5 this weekend." And after a while, you wouldn't even like that either. Even if you were the one that came up with this boundary, you still would want to push against it. We like having space and freedom, and we don't like being told what we can and can't do. In some ways, the same is true when it comes to sex. From the start of this series, some of us may have immediately rolled our eyes and thought, "Oh, here we go. Now we're just going to hear, 'Don't have sex,' for the next few weeks." And you dreaded it. This could be true for people who have been sexually active and people who haven't. Sometimes even if we're being told no and we agree, we still don't like it. On the flip side, none of us like the way it feels if our boundaries are crossed or pressured. If you've been asked to send a picture you didn't want to send, or you were guilted into going further physically than you wanted to go, then you know the feeling that came along with that. Whether or not you agreed to it, you still didn't like the way it made you feel afterwards. In the same way, if you've ever been in the heat of the moment and placed pressure on someone else to do something, then once you came to your senses, you probably didn't like the way you felt about yourself either. So while we don't like being told what to do, we also don't like the way it feels when lines are crossed or pushed. Some people have talked about this idea of how when you're in a sinful state of mind, you're actually insane for that period of time. You believe the lies of your heart in that moment, and reality does not exist to you. When you sin, it's because you don't have a sane state of mind. And think about it. When you're in a fit of rage, you can't think clearly. When you're dead set on getting what you want, when you're fixated until you get it, you're actually numb to any of the consequences until you become lucid again. You come back to your senses. You wake up and say, "What was I thinking?" Now, I haven't done any psychological studies on that, so I don't know how much of that idea of sin making you insane is actually true or to what extent, but based on what I see in the scriptures, I feel like there's definitely some truth to that. Boundaries stop us before we become insane and violate what we know to be true. They help us see lies and evaluate them before we submit to them. So what if limits and boundaries were never meant to be a bad thing? And what if they actually freed us to make empowered decisions for ourselves? We're going to bring the series back full circle and go back to the garden. And what I mean by that is going back to the beginning when God created all of this and set it into motion. But before we do that, I want us to quickly look at another passage that we've talked about in this series from 1 Corinthians. Flee sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Here's the thing. We are sexual beings. That means it's okay to have sexual desire, be physically attracted to someone else, and to be curious about sex. Sex is good and it's powerful. And because it's powerful and good, we're instructed to flee or to run from the misuse of it, from sexual immorality, and instead run towards sexual integrity. Paul's telling us that when we're about to cross boundary lines, we should turn face and go the other way. But what is a boundary? The dictionary defines boundary as a line that marks the limit of an area. Think about boundaries this way. A boundary keeps something out. What outside threats might try to attack your value of sexual integrity, and how do you keep them out? And just to clarify, I'm talking about threats like temptation and stuff, not things like sexual abuse. That's a whole separate issue, and I just need to make that note clear. But a boundary keeps something out. It also keeps something in. What's valuable enough to be worth protecting? A boundary doesn't have gaps or loopholes. Think about a fence around a park or a fortress around a castle. It doesn't provide any safety if there are gaps or weak points. When it comes to sexual integrity, what would it look like to have a gapless boundary? A boundary can be seen from far away, whether inside or outside. So how might you make your sexual integrity boundary obvious for yourself and for others? And some of you may be thinking, of course, this is when you tell us all the things that we can't or shouldn't do. You're going to tell us how sex is bad and we shouldn't do it. And if you feel that way, I get it. It's probably exactly how I felt when I was in high school. But when you go back to the garden where God created Adam and Eve, we read this. Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. Why is this Bible verse even included in the Bible? So we can see God's intention. For people to be free. For Adam and Eve to be intimate with each other and feel no shame. For them to be completely known without feeling dirty or bad about it. Were they sexual beings? Of course, God told them to make babies. This was simply the perfect world that God had created for them. Now you may be thinking, that sounds good to me, sign me up for that. They were free, which means they had no boundaries. No. I said they had no shame. They still had boundaries. In fact, if you move forward a chapter, you read this verse. Check out what Adam said back to God. He answered, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. So I hid. Wait, so what happened? First they're naked and they feel no shame, and then they're hiding because they were scared and naked. What happened between these two verses is that Adam and Eve crossed the boundaries that God had set up for them. And once the boundary was gone, that's when they felt fearful and ashamed. Adam and Eve saw boundaries from the beginning. There was a boundary separating sky and earth, light and dark, sea and land. Humans were placed within the garden, and that was their boundary. There was a certain tree they couldn't eat from. Again, a boundary. There was a place for everything, and every boundary that God created was for Adam and Eve's good. Here's the deal. Boundaries are good, and boundaries are powerful. We see this all around us. People who set boundaries for their money are typically in better financial shape than people who simply buy whatever they want. People who have boundaries around their physical health typically feel better than people who don't. People who have boundaries around the way they talk to people typically offend fewer people. It's the same in our sexual lives. When we decide that our boundary will be to live within sexual integrity, and we honor that boundary and the boundaries of others, we actually begin to experience the type of life and sexual integrity that God designed for us. We experience the sexual freedom that God designed. Now, as we wrap up this week and in this series, please remember two things. These are 2 habits for you to put into practice because they will be good for you. I promise. They will move you toward the abundant life that God has for you. First, honor your boundaries. Start looking for healthy ways to implement boundaries in all kinds of areas in your life, and not just in your sexual life. But what could that look like? Here's some ideas for starters. Practice saying no. If you can practice saying no to small things like watching a movie that you don't want to see, hanging out with people that you don't want to hang out with, or scrolling all night, even if you kind of want to, it will help you to feel more comfortable saying no when the stakes are higher, if you've already practiced the art of saying no when stakes aren't so high. You'll become more confident at using your voice to express what's not okay with you. Decide how you want to be treated. Determine right now what honor looks like to you. Set the standard for what's okay and what's not okay when it comes to how others treat you. Then tell someone you trust, someone who can look out for you and make sure you're getting the honor you deserve. Pre-deciding will help you stick to your standard and help you recognize when you're not being honored. Also, say something. It's possible that some of you have asked to be honored and not given your consent or permission, but your voice wasn't respected. And because of that, you're dealing with things like guilt, shame, anger, secrecy, and that's a lot. And I'm really sorry that you're having to deal with that. Please don't confuse your feelings of wrong with feelings of guilt. No one should ever feel guilty for something that someone else did to them. What was done to you wasn't honor. But you need to know that you still deserve to be honored. You should still expect honor. One of the best ways that you can expect honor is to say something and share what has happened to you with someone you love and trust. Someone who wants to honor you by helping you through this experience in your past. Next, honor their boundaries. Be the kind of person who knows how to respect other people. Ask yourself, am I doing what's best for the other person despite what I want from them? Look at your choices, look at your words, look at your behaviors, then look at your relationships. Do you show honor in all of them? Understand that consent is the first step towards respect. Consent is definitely important and it's a huge part of honoring people, but don't view your relationships, behaviors, and choices through the lens of what the other person says yes or didn't say no to. Instead, look at it through the lens of honoring what's best for them. Accept the no. Sometimes one of the easiest ways to honor others is simply to listen to their no. When someone tells you no, they mean it. So honor them by stopping right then and there. In addition, sometimes you need to pay attention to the no that you feel in your own conscience, even when you want to say yes, even when the other person is saying yes or isn't saying no. From the beginning, God's intention for sex wasn't for it to be shameful. God wanted people to experience freedom and intimacy. God wanted it to be good, and part of what made it so good was boundaries. What if we actually experienced more of what God intended by practicing these boundaries in our own lives? Imagine if it led to more freedom and less shame. This is what God wants for us, and this is what God will help us do. Boundaries are good, and boundaries are powerful. Now, some of you may still have some questions about specific boundaries with specific things. Like I said, there's lots of layers to this conversation. Feel free to explore those questions in your group. Some of us sat down and talked about what a Christian standard of modesty might look like. And if you're interested in that conversation, you can check out that link below here on our channel. And last year, I made a series of videos addressing things like same-sex attraction and LGBTQ plus issues and questions. And I'll link those as well if you'd like to watch that. Congratulations on making it through this series with us. Thank you for being here and for valuing each other and your relationship with God enough to have some of the tough conversations. We'll start a new series next week, and in the meantime, enjoy your time with your group.